In Salem, Massachusetts, fear had a face, and it looked just like your neighbor. One accusation could end a life. And tonight, you'll hear how it happened. Salem Witch Trials, Dark Secrets for a Bedtime Story. Chapter 1. The Dawn of Fear. You walk through the narrow streets of Salem Village on this cold February morning in the year of our Lord 1692. And the cobblestones beneath your feet seem to whisper secrets they have held for generations. The air carries the sharp bite of winter, mingling wood smoke from countless chimneys with the faint, earthy scent of snow that fell 3 days past and now clings to the eaves of weathered wooden houses like forgotten prayers. Your breath forms small clouds in the frigid air as you pause before the Paris parsonage, a modest two-story dwelling that squats against the gray morning sky like a creature hunched in contemplation. From within comes the sound of muffled voices, urgent and low, punctuated by the occasional creak of wooden floorboards under restless feet. You draw your woolen cloak tighter around your shoulders, feeling the coarse weave scratch against your neck, a reminder of the harsh realities that govern this devout Puritan settlement. The Reverend Samuel Parris emerges from his front door, his tall, gaunt frame cutting a severe silhouette against the pale morning light. His dark coat flaps in the wind like the wings of some great bird of prey, and his eyes, when they sweep across the village green, hold a glint of something that might be fear or might be fervor. It is often difficult, you realize, to distinguish between the two in Salem Village. Behind him, barely visible through the partially opened door, you catch a glimpse of his daughter Elizabeth and his niece Abigail Williams. The girls huddled together near the hearth, their faces pale as winter frost, their eyes darting toward shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of the room despite the steady flame of the fire. Elizabeth's hand trembles as she reaches for a pewter cup, and the slight rattling sound it makes against the wooden table carries through the crisp air with startling clarity. You continue your walk through the village, passing houses where curtains twitch at windows and doors, open just enough for wary eyes to peer out before closing again with soft, decisive clicks. The meeting house stands at the center of the settlement, its plain wooden walls bearing no ornamentation save for the weight of countless prayers that have soaked into its very timber. The building seems to lean slightly forward, as if straining to hear the whispered confessions and desperate pleas that will soon fill its austere interior. The sound of footsteps on frozen earth draws your attention, and you turn to see goodwife Sarah Osborne making her way toward the village well. Her steps are careful, measured, each footfall placed with the precision of someone who knows that every movement is being watched. The hem of her dark skirt brushes against the patches of ice that cling to the ground, creating a soft, wisping sound that mingles with the distant call of crows gathering in the bare branches of the oak trees that border the village. At the well, Sarah draws water with practiced efficiency, the rope creaking through the pulley as the wooden bucket descends into the dark depths below. The sound of the bucket hitting water far below echoes up from the well shaft like a voice calling from some hidden realm beneath the earth. When she raises the bucket, droplets fall from its rim, each one catching the weak sunlight for a moment before disappearing into the thirsty ground. You notice how the other villagers give Sarah a wide berth as she goes about her task. Their gazes linger on her bent form with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that has begun to permeate the very air of Salem like morning mist. Conversations halt when she approaches, only to resume in hushed tones once she has passed, leaving behind a wake of whispered questions and sideways glances. The morning bell tolls from the meeting house tower, its bronze voice carrying across the settlement with somber authority. Each chime seems to hang in the air longer than it should, as if the sound itself is reluctant to fade into the growing unease that has settled over Salem like a heavy blanket. You count the tolls, 7 in all, marking the hour when the devout begin their daily preparations for worship and contemplation. As you walk past the Putnam household, you hear the sound of heated conversation drifting through the walls. Thomas Putnam's voice rises above the others, sharp with indignation and something that might be righteous anger or might be something altogether more complex. The words are indistinct, but the tone carries clearly enough, collared with the fervor of a man who believes himself to be fighting against forces that threaten everything he holds dear. Ann Putnam Jr. appears at the window for a moment, her young face pressed against the glass, her breath fogging the pane as she stares out at the village with eyes that seem far too old for her 12 years. There is something in her expression that makes you pause, a knowing quality that sits uneasily on features still soft with childhood. When she notices your gaze, she draws back quickly, leaving only the ghost of her breath on the cold glass. The wind picks up, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something else, something harder to identify, but unmistakably present. It might be the smell of fear, if fear had a scent, or perhaps it is simply the odor of too many people living too closely together through the long New England winter, their patience worn thin by cold and hardship and the constant pressure of maintaining perfect piety in the eyes of both God and their neighbors. You pass the home of Rebecca Nurse, one of the most respected women in Salem Village, And even here you sense the subtle change that has begun to transform the settlement. The house stands sturdy and well maintained, its windows gleaming with the care that comes from a lifetime of diligent housekeeping. But there is something in the way the shadows fall across its doorway that suggests even the most virtuous among Salem's residents are not immune to the creeping in dread that has begun to take root in the community's collective heart. From inside the house comes the sound of spinning wheel. It's rhythmic. We're providing a counterpoint to the irregular gusts of wind that rattle the shutters. The sound is comforting, familiar, a reminder of the ordinary tasks that continue even as extraordinary circumstances begin to unfold. Yet even this simple domestic sound seems somehow charged with tension, as if the very act of creating thread from wool has become fraught with hidden significance. The meeting house bell tolls again, a single chime that serves as a call to morning prayers. Villagers begin to emerge from their homes, wrapped in heavy cloaks and woolen scarves. Their faces set in expressions of determined piety. They move with purpose toward the meeting house. But there is something in their gait that suggests haste born not of eagerness, but of a desire to be seen fulfilling their religious obligations in full view of their neighbors. You join the stream of worshipers, feeling the warmth of other bodies despite the cold air, hearing the soft shuffle of many feet on frozen ground and the whispered exchanges of morning greetings. Good morrow, Goodman Fletcher. God's blessings upon you this day, good wife Stevens. The words are familiar, comfortable, part of the daily ritual that binds this community together. Yet underneath the pleasantries runs an undercurrent of something less wholesome. Inside the meeting house, you take your place on one of the hard wooden benches that face the pulpit where Reverend Paris will soon deliver the morning's sermon. The building is austere in the extreme, its whitewashed walls bearing no decoration save for the plain wooden cross that hangs behind the pulpit. The only sounds are the settling of the congregation, the creak of wooden benches under the weight of bodies, and the soft whisper of pages turning as the devout prepare their Bibles for the service to come. The air inside the meeting house is thick with the mingled scents of unwashed wool, tallow candles, and the faint mustiness that comes from a building where too many people gather too frequently in too small a space. Yet there is something else as well, a tension that seems to emanate from the congregation itself, as if each person present carries within them a burden of suspicion that grows heavier with each passing day. Reverend Paris takes his place at the pulpit, his dark robes making him appear almost ethereal in the dim light that filters through the meeting house windows. His hands, when he places them on the worn wooden surface before him, are pale and thin, the fingers long and delicate like those of a man more accustomed to handling books than tools. When he raises his eyes to survey his congregation, there is something in his gaze that makes you shift uncomfortably on the hard bench. His voice, when he begins to speak, carries clearly through the hushed interior of the meeting house. Each word carefully enunciated and weighted with the authority of his position as the community's spiritual leader. But underneath the familiar cadences of religious oratory, there is a new note, a tremor that suggests the Reverend himself is not immune to the subtle forces that have begun to stir in Salem Village. The sermon begins with familiar themes: the eternal struggle between good and evil, the constant vigilance required to maintain one's soul in a state of grace, the dangers that lurk in the shadows for those who let their guard down even for a moment. But as Reverend Paris continues, his words begin to take on a more specific focus. Speaking of evil that walks among the faithful, of corruption that can hide behind the mask of piety, of the need for the righteous to remain ever watchful for signs of the devil's influence in their midst. Around you, the congregation listens with rapt attention, but you sense that their focus is not entirely on the Reverend's words. Eyes dart toward neighbors. Lingering assessments are made of expressions and reactions. Mental notes are taken of who nods with particular fervor and who seems perhaps a shade too thoughtful in response to certain passages. The meeting house has become a place where every gesture carries potential significance, where every word spoken or left unspoken might later be recalled and examined for hidden meaning. When the service concludes, the congregation files out into the cold morning air with the same measured pace they used entering. But now their conversations carry a different quality. The usual discussions of weather and crops and community concerns have given way to more guarded exchanges, words carefully chosen and often left unfinished, as if each speaker suddenly realizes that completing certain thoughts might be dangerous. You linger outside the meeting house as the crowd disperses, watching as small groups form and dissolve with the fluid unpredictability of water seeking its level. There is Martha Corey speaking quietly with her husband Giles, their heads bent close together in conversation that stops abruptly when they notice others approaching. There is John Proctor helping his wife Elizabeth navigate the icy steps of the meeting house. His protective gesture somehow carrying more weight than it would have just weeks before. The sound of approaching horses draws your attention to the road that leads from Salem Village to Salem Town, where a small group of mounted men approaches at a pace that suggests urgency without quite crossing the line into unseemly haste. The lead rider is a man you recognize as Deputy Constable Joseph Herrick, his official bearing unmistakable even at a distance. Behind him ride two other men whose faces are obscured by the broad brims of their hats, but whose posture suggests the weight of official responsibility. As they draw nearer, you see that Deputy Herrick carries a leather satchel secured to his saddle, the kind used for transporting important documents. The sight of it sends a ripple of unease through the villagers who have noticed the approaching riders, and conversations that were already hushed become mere whispers before dying away entirely. Even the children seem to sense the gravity of the moment, gathering closer to their parents and watching the newcomers with wide, curious eyes. The riders dismount near the meeting house, their horses' breath forming great clouds of vapor in the cold air. The animals stamp their feet and shake their heads, their harness leather creaking in the stillness, metal bits jingling with a sound like small bells. Deputy Herrick speaks briefly with Reverend Paris, their conversation too low to overhear, but intense enough that both men's faces grow increasingly grave as it continues. After several minutes, Reverend Paris nods solemnly and calls for the attention of those villagers who remain near the meeting house. His voice carries across the village green with the same authority it held during the morning's sermon. But now there is an edge to it that makes you pull your cloak more tightly around your shoulders, despite the fact that the wind has died down. Good people of Salem Village, he begins, his words forming small puffs of vapor as they meet the cold air. We have received word from the magistrates in Salem town regarding the unusual afflictions that have befallen some among our number. There are to be examinations conducted, formal inquiries into the nature of these disturbances that have troubled our community. A murmur runs through the assembled villagers, a sound like wind moving through dry leaves. You see hands unconsciously reach for loved ones, protective gestures that speak to fears that have not yet been fully articulated, but are nonetheless deeply felt. The word examinations hangs in the air with ominous weight, carrying implications that everyone present understands, even if none would speak them aloud. Deputy Herrick steps forward, his hand resting on the leather satchel that contains what you now realize must be warrants or other legal documents. His voice is carefully neutral, professional in the way that officials cultivate when delivering news that they know will be unwelcome. The examinations will begin tomorrow at the meeting house. All members of the community are expected to cooperate fully with the appointed magistrates. The afternoon sun, what little of it manages to penetrate the gathering clouds, casts long shadows across the village green. These shadows seem to reach toward the assembled villagers like grasping fingers, and you notice how people unconsciously step back from them as if darkness itself has become something to fear. The bare branches of the oak trees that border the common area create intricate patterns of light and shadow on the ground, patterns that shift and dance with every breath of wind. As the crowd begins to disperse, you observe the way people move differently now than they did just hours before. There is a self-consciousness to their gait, a hyper-awareness of being observed that transforms even the simple act of walking from one's home to the well into a performance fraught with potential consequences. Mothers draw their children closer. Husbands and wives exchange meaningful glances, and more than one person glances back over their shoulder as if expecting to find someone following them. The sound of a door closing echoes across the village with unusual sharpness, as if the very air has become more dense, more capable of carrying sound than it was before. Following closely behind comes the sound of another door and another, as Salem Village draws in upon itself like a flower closing at the approach of night. Windows that normally would remain uncovered until full dark are shuttered early, and the warm glow of candlelight that usually spills invitingly from these openings becomes trapped behind wooden barriers. You make your own way home as evening approaches, your footsteps echoing hollow on the frozen ground. The village that seemed merely cold and austere in the morning light now carries an oppressive quality that seems to press down from the darkening sky above. Even the smoke rising from chimneys appears different somehow, more sluggish in its ascent, as if the very air resists its passage. Behind you, Salem Village settles into what should be the comfortable routine of evening preparations. Livestock are secured for the night, final chores completed. Families gathered around hearths for evening prayers and simple meals. But underneath these familiar rhythms, you sense the presence of something new and unwelcome, a fear that has taken root in the collective heart of the community and now begins to grow with the inexorable persistence of weeds in fertile soil. The first day of what will become known to history as the Salem Witch Trials draws to a close. But you understand that something fundamental has changed in this small Puritan settlement. The trust that once bound neighbors together has begun to fray, replaced by suspicion and fear that will soon transform Salem Village into something far darker than anyone present could possibly imagine. As you close your own door against the gathering night, you cannot escape the feeling that Salem itself has become aware of what is about to unfold within its borders, and that the very stones and timbers of the village are holding their breath in anticipation of the terrible events to come. If you enjoyed this story and want to join me for more nights of history and mystery, subscribe now, tap the bell icon, and let's journey back in time together. Chapter 2. First Accusations. You wake before dawn on the morning of February 20, the extra day that leap year brings. Though few in Salem village see it as anything but another cold morning in what has become an increasingly troubled winter. The darkness outside your window seems thicker than usual, more reluctant to yield to the approaching day. And when you light your candle, the flame flickers as if struggling against invisible forces that seek to extinguish it before it can establish itself. The sounds that greet you as you prepare for the day are subtly different from those you have grown accustomed to over the long months of winter. There is still the familiar chorus of roosters announcing the dawn, still the creak of settling timber as houses adjust to the temperature changes that come with sunrise. But underneath these ordinary sounds runs something new, a tension that seems to vibrate through the very air like the string of a bow drawn too tight. When you step outside, your breath immediately forms clouds in the frigid air. But this morning, even this simple phenomenon seems charged with significance. The vapor that rises from your lips dissipates slowly, hanging in the still air longer than it should, creating shapes that your mind cannot help but interpret as faces, reaching hands, figures dancing just at the edge of recognition before dissolving into nothingness. The village green lies before you, covered with a thin layer of frost that turns the grass into countless tiny mirrors reflecting the pale morning light. Your footsteps crunch softly as you cross this space, each sound seeming to echo longer than it should in the hushed atmosphere that has settled over Salem village like a heavy quilt. Other early risers move about their morning tasks, but their movements are hurried, furtive, as if each person hopes to complete their necessary activities and return to the relative safety of their homes before what exactly none could say. Near the Paris parsonage, a small crowd has already begun to gather despite the early hour. You draw closer, pulled by the same morbid curiosity that seems to grip everyone in the village. And as you approach, you can make out the voices of Dr. William Griggs and several other men engaged in intense, hushed conversation. The doctor's bag sits at his feet, its worn leather surface beaded with moisture from the morning frost. And his expression carries the gravity of a man who has witnessed something that challenges his understanding of the natural world. I have examined them thoroughly, Dr. Griggs is saying, his voice carrying the authority of medical training, but tinged with an uncertainty that makes the words seem somehow less solid than they should. There is no physical ailment that I can identify, no fever or injury that would account for their behaviors. The fits they experience, the contortions, the strange utterances, I fear we are dealing with something beyond the realm of medicine. Through the window of the parsonage, you can see movement, shadows passing back and forth across the candlelit interior. Occasionally, a sound emerges from within, a cry or moan that seems to carry more anguish than any physical pain should produce. These sounds cut through the morning air with startling clarity, causing the men gathered outside to exchange glances loaded with meaning that none dare speak aloud. Reverend Paris appears at his front door, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his dark coat wrinkled as if he has slept in it, his hair unkempt in a way that suggests he has run his hands through it many times during a sleepless night. His eyes, when they sweep across the gathered villagers, hold a wild quality that makes you step back instinctively, as if proximity to his distress might somehow prove contagious. "Neighbors," he begins, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that might be desperation. "I call upon your Christian charity and your wisdom in this dark hour that has befallen my household. My daughter Elizabeth and my niece Abigail have been afflicted by forces that I dare not name, but which I fear we all suspect. Dr. Griggs has found no natural cause for their condition, and I fear we must consider explanations that our rational minds would prefer to reject." From within the house comes another cry, this one clearly in Abigail Williams' voice, though distorted by pain or terror or something else entirely. The sound rises and falls like a lament, wordless, but somehow communicating a distress so profound that several of the women in the growing crowd clasp their hands to their hearts in sympathy. Children present press closer to their parents, their young faces reflecting confusion and fear that they cannot yet articulate. Thomas Putnam pushes through the crowd, his bearing suggesting a man who has arrived at a decision after careful consideration and is now prepared to act upon it regardless of consequences. His wife Anne follows close behind, and you notice that young Anne Putnam Jr. clings to her mother's skirt with a grip so tight that her knuckles show white even in the dim morning light. The girl's face, when you catch sight of it, bears an expression of excitement that sits uneasily alongside the fear that permeates the gathering. "Reverend Paris," Thomas Putnam says, his voice carrying across the assembly with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard and heeded. "We cannot allow such afflictions to continue without taking action to protect our community. If the devil has indeed found a foothold in Salem Village, then we must root out his agents before they can spread their corruption further. among the faithful. A murmur of agreement ripples through the crowd, but you notice that it is not universal. Some faces show uncertainty, doubt, perhaps even skepticism. Then, though these expressions are quickly suppressed when their owners realize they are being observed. The pressure of community opinion in Salem Village has always been strong, but this morning it carries an additional weight that makes dissent seem not merely unpopular, but potentially dangerous. Mary Sibley, a woman known for her practical nature and her skill with herbs and healing remedies, steps forward with the confidence of someone who has arrived at a solution to a troubling problem. Her voice carries clearly in the still morning air, and her words fall into the listening silence with the weight of stones dropped into still water. I have consulted with Tituba, she announces, referring to Reverend Paris's slave woman from Barbados, and she has agreed to attempt a test that may reveal the source of these afflictions. It is an old method, one known in the islands where she was born, and though it may seem strange to our ways, desperate times call for desperate measures. The mention of Tituba sends another ripple through the crowd, this one carrying undertones that are harder to interpret. The slave woman has always been something of a mystery to the villagers, her dark skin and foreign birth marking her as different in a community that values conformity above almost all other virtues. Stories have circulated about her knowledge of herbs and remedies unknown to English tradition. And while this knowledge has proven useful in treating minor ailments, it has also made her a subject of whispered speculation. Reverend Paris's reaction to Mary Sibley's suggestion is immediate and complex, his face cycling through expressions of desperation, hope, and fear in rapid succession. His position as a minister of the gospel should lead him to reject anything that smacks of folk magic or pagan practices. Yet the continued suffering of his daughter and niece has clearly pushed him beyond the boundaries of orthodox solutions. What manner of test? He asks, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make his participation in such questionable activities more real, more damning in the eyes of both God and his community. Mary Sibley glances around the assembled crowd before answering, perhaps gauging the level of acceptance or opposition her proposal might encounter. When she speaks again, her voice carries the matter of fact tone of someone describing a perfectly reasonable course of action, though the words themselves seem to hang in the air with ominous significance. A witch cake, she says simply, made with rye meal and the urine of the afflicted girls. It is to be fed to a dog, and if witchcraft is indeed the cause of their suffering, the animal's behavior will reveal the truth of the matter. and perhaps even identify those responsible for these evil works. The response to this suggestion is immediate and varied. Several villagers draw back with expressions of disgust or alarm, while others lean forward with obvious interest. Children are hurriedly ushered away by parents who suddenly realize that the conversation has taken a turn into territory they would prefer their young ones not to witness. The moral complexity of the situation is written clearly on every adult face present. The conflict between desperate hope and religious orthodoxy playing out in real time. From inside the parsonage comes another series of cries, these more prolonged and distressing than those that came before. The sounds seem to galvanize Reverend Paris, pushing him past his theological reservations and into the realm of parental desperation. He nods curtly to Mary Sibley, though his face shows the cost of this decision in lines of anguish that seem to have appeared overnight. The crowd begins to disperse as the strange business gets underway, but the departure is reluctant, marked by backward glances and hushed conversations that continue as people make their way to their various morning tasks. You find yourself walking alongside Goodman Porter, a farmer known for his level-headedness, and you notice that his usual steady demeanor has been replaced by an agitation that manifests in quick, nervous gestures and a tendency to look over his shoulder. "Strange times," he mutters, more to himself than to you. When Christian folk resort to such methods, yet what else is a father to do when his child suffers so? I have daughters of my own, and I pray God they are never afflicted as poor Elizabeth Paris has been. By midday, word of the witch cake experiment has spread throughout Salem Village with the speed that only truly shocking news can achieve. The results, when they come, are reported in whispers that seem to carry more weight than shouted proclamations might have done. The dog, it is said, exhibited strange behavior immediately upon consuming the concoction, howling and running in circles, pawing at the air as if fighting off invisible attackers, before finally collapsing in what appeared to be a fit similar to those experienced by the afflicted girls. The implications of this outcome are not lost on the villagers, and by afternoon a new atmosphere has settled over Salem Village, one charged with a mixture of vindication and terror. If the test has indeed proven that witchcraft is at work in their community, then the next logical step is to identify those responsible. This prospect both thrills and horrifies the residents, who suddenly find themselves looking at neighbors and friends with new eyes, searching for signs of guilt or corruption that they might previously have overlooked. It is Tituba who provides the next development in this unfolding drama, though whether she does so willingly or under pressure from increasingly desperate questioning is a matter that will be debated for generations to come. When confronted by Reverend Paris and others about her knowledge of the afflictions, she initially denies any involvement in supernatural activities, but as the interrogation continues, her responses begin to change. You are not present for this questioning, but the results become known throughout the village with the same rapid circulation that marked news of the witch cake. Tituba, it is reported, has admitted to practicing magic, though she claims to have done so reluctantly and only under the compulsion of others. More significantly, she has named names, identifying Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne as her accomplices in these dark arts. The naming of these two women sends shockwaves through Salem village that are almost physical in their intensity. Sarah Good is a beggar woman, poor and often troublesome, whose presence at doors throughout the village has long been tolerated with reluctant Christian charity, but little genuine warmth. Sarah Osborne, while more respectable in terms of property and social standing, has made herself unpopular through various conflicts and disputes, including questions about her moral conduct that have provided fodder for gossip for months. As evening approaches on this day that has transformed Salem village irrevocably, you observe the changes that have already begun to take hold in the community. Doors that were previously left unbarred are now secured with obvious care. Conversations that might once have continued pleasantly into the night are cut short as participants suddenly remember urgent tasks that require their immediate attention. Children who normally play freely in the village common are kept closer to home, their games subdued and their laughter notably absent. The meeting house, which served yesterday as a place of familiar worship, now looms against the darkening sky with an air of foreboding that transforms its simple architecture into something more ominous. Tomorrow, it is announced, the first formal examinations will take place there, with magistrates from Salem town presiding over proceedings that will attempt to determine the truth of the accusations that have been made. You retire to your home as full darkness settles over Salem village, but sleep proves elusive. The sounds of the night seem amplified. Every creaking timber and whistling wind carrying potential significance that keeps you alert and listening. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howls, and you cannot help but wonder whether this is natural animal behavior or something more sinister, some manifestation of the dark forces that have apparently taken root in your community. The accusations have been made, the first name spoken aloud, and Salem village has crossed a threshold from which there can be no return. What began as concern for the welfare of two afflicted girls has transformed into something larger and more dangerous, a mechanism that will soon consume innocent and guilty alike in its relentless pursuit of hidden evil. As you finally drift toward fitful sleep, you cannot escape the feeling that you have witnessed not just the beginning of a series of trials, but the birth of something far more terrible, a force that will reshape Salem Village in ways that none of its residents can yet imagine. The wind outside your window carries with it the sound of doors closing, bolts sliding home, and the whispered prayers of a community that has suddenly discovered that the devil they have always feared in the abstract may have taken up residence in their very midst. Tomorrow will bring formal proceedings, official examinations, and the first real test of whether Salem Village can maintain its sense of justice and Christian charity in the face of supernatural terror. Tonight, however, brings only fear, suspicion, and the growing realization that the bonds of trust that have held the community together may not survive the revelations that are yet to come. Chapter 3: Trials and Coerced Confessions. You arrive at the Salem Village Meeting House on the morning of March 1st as the bell tolls 8 times, each chime resonating through air so still it seems to hold its breath in anticipation of what is about to unfold. The building that has served your community for worship and town meetings has been transformed overnight into something altogether more ominous. Its familiar wooden walls now serving as the boundaries of what will become Salem's first official witch examination. The interior of the meeting house has been rearranged to accommodate the legal proceedings that are about to commence. Where once simple wooden benches faced the pulpit in orderly rows, there is now a more complex arrangement that speaks to the adversarial nature of what is about to unfold. A table has been placed before the pulpit for the magistrates, its worn wooden surface bearing the weight of ledgers, inkwells, and the official documents that transform suspicion into legal process. You take your place among the crowd of villagers who have gathered to witness these proceedings, feeling the press of bodies around you, sensing the mixture of excitement and dread that emanates from your neighbors like heat from a forge. The air in the meeting house is thick with the scent of unwashed wool, nervous perspiration, and the tallow candles that provide supplementary light to the weak sunshine filtering through the building's small windows. Underneath these familiar odors runs something else, a metallic taste that coats your throat and makes swallowing difficult. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin enter through the main door with the measured pace of men conscious of their authority and the gravity of their task. Their dark judicial robes rustle with each step, the sound carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere that has fallen over the assembled crowd. Behind them walks the court clerk, his arms laden with the materials necessary to record whatever testimony and confessions the day may bring. Hathorn takes his seat at the head table with the confidence of a man accustomed to presiding over legal proceedings. Though you suspect that none of his previous experience has prepared him for the nature of the cases he will hear today, his face, when he surveys the crowd, shows determination mixed with something that might be eagerness, as if he relishes the opportunity to root out evil from the community he has been charged to protect. The first accused woman to be brought before the magistrates is Sarah Good, and her appearance immediately sets a tone that will color everything that follows. She is escorted by Deputy Constable Herrick, her hands bound with rough rope that has left red marks on her wrists where it has rubbed against her skin. Her clothing is tattered and dirty, speaking to the poverty that has made her a target of community disapproval long before supernatural suspicions fell upon her. Sarah's face, as she stands before her accusers, shows a mixture of defiance and fear that creates an expression almost painful to witness. Her eyes dart around the crowded meeting house, taking in the faces of neighbors who have watched her beg for food and shelter, people who have sometimes helped her and sometimes turned her away, all of them now sitting in judgment of charges that could cost her life. Magistrate Hathorn's voice, when he begins the examination, carries the weight of legal authority. But there is something in his tone that suggests he has already reached conclusions about the guilt of the woman who stands before him. His questions are not those of a neutral investigator seeking truth, but rather those of a prosecutor building a case against a defendant whose guilt he considers established. Sarah Good. He begins, his words echoing in the packed meeting house with ceremonial gravity. You stand accused of practicing witchcraft and of afflicting the persons of Elizabeth Parris, Abigail Williams, Ann Putnam Jr., and Elizabeth Hubbard with supernatural torments. How do you answer to these charges? Sarah Good's response comes in a voice hoarse, with either fear or defiance, though the two emotions have become so intertwined in her situation that distinguishing between them seems impossible. I am innocent, she declares, the words carrying across the silent meeting house with surprising strength. I have done nothing to harm any child in this village. I know nothing of witchcraft, and I serve only God, though He has seen fit to test me with poverty and hardship. Before Magistrate Hathorn can respond, a commotion erupts from the section of the meeting house where the afflicted girls are seated. Abigail Williams suddenly cries out, her voice high and piercing. Cutting through the formal atmosphere of the legal proceedings like a knife through silk. Her body contorts in her seat, her back arching at an angle that seems to defy natural flexibility, while her hands claw at the air as if fighting off invisible attackers.
She is here!
Abigail screams, her eyes fixed on empty air above the heads of the assembled crowd.
I see her, Spectre.
She comes to torment me even now.
Even in this holy place.
Her words dissolve into wordless cries of apparent agony that send ripples of fear and excitement through the packed meeting house. Elizabeth Parris joins her cousin's display almost immediately, her young body writhing in the wooden pew as if invisible hands are pulling at her limbs, twisting them into positions that make the watching adults gasp in horror and sympathy. Her cries blend with Abigail's to create a chorus of anguish that transforms the meeting house from a place of legal proceeding into something that resembles a battlefield between seen and unseen forces. The effect on the assembled crowd is immediate and profound. Women clutch their children closer. Men lean forward in their seats as if proximity might help them better understand what they are witnessing. And more than one voice can be heard murmuring prayers for protection against whatever evil forces have apparently manifested in their midst. The very air seems to thicken with tension, as if the building itself is struggling to contain the supernatural drama unfolding within its walls. Magistrate Hathorne observes this spectacle with an expression that combines judicial satisfaction with religious fervor, as if the girl's fits provide confirmation of suspicions he has harbored all along. When he turns his attention back to Sarah Good, his manner has hardened perceptibly. The neutral tone of legal inquiry replaced by something that sounds more like accusation than investigation. You see how your specter torments these innocent children, even as you stand in denial of your crimes. He declares, his voice rising to carry over the continued cries of the afflicted girls. Will you not confess your guilt and spare these young ones further suffering? Surely a Christian woman would not allow such torment to continue if she possessed the power to end it. Sarah Good's response comes through gritted teeth, her own distress at witnessing the girls' apparent agony warring with her desperate need to maintain her innocence. I tell you, I am innocent of these charges. I have no power to torment these children, no knowledge of how to practice such evil arts. If they suffer, it is not by my hand or through my agency. From his position at the magistrate's table, Jonathan Corwin interjects with a question that reveals the theological complexity underlying these proceedings. His voice carries the measured tone of a man attempting to apply reason to circumstances that seem to defy rational explanation. Sarah Good, if you are innocent as you claim, Then how do you explain the testimony of these afflicted children? Are we to believe that they suffer these torments without cause, or that they willfully deceive this court and their own families? What enemy have you that would work such mischief in your name? This question strikes at the heart of the impossible position in which the accused find themselves. For to maintain innocence in the face of spectral evidence requires either accusing others of the crimes or suggesting that the afflicted are lying, neither of which provides a path toward vindication. Sarah Good's face shows her understanding of this trap, and when she speaks again, her voice carries the desperation of someone who realizes that logic and truth may not be sufficient to save her. I know not who afflicts these children, she says, her words coming slowly, as if each one must be carefully weighed before being spoken. Perhaps it is Sarah Osborne, for she is more likely than I to be guilty of such practices. I have seen her keep strange company and heard tales of her unseemly conduct that might well lead to congress with evil spirits. The deflection of blame on another accused woman sends a new ripple of excitement through the crowd. And you notice how eagerly the spectators lean forward to catch every word of this development. The children's cries continue to provide a disturbing soundtrack to the proceedings, their anguish rising and falling like waves breaking against a shore, each cry seeming to punctuate Sarah Good's words with supernatural emphasis. Sarah Osborne is brought forward next, her bearing markedly different from that of Sarah Good. Where the first accused woman appeared defeated by poverty and circumstance, Sarah Osborne carries herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to better treatment. Though her current situation has clearly shaken her confidence, her clothes, while not fine, are clean and well maintained, speaking to a social status that makes her presence among the accused all the more shocking to the assembled villagers. The questioning of Sarah Osborne follows a similar pattern to that employed with Sarah Good, but the responses reveal a woman of different temperament and social understanding. When Magistrate Hathorne presents the charges against her, her denial comes with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed and respected. I am as innocent as the child unborn, she declares, her voice carrying clearly through the meeting house, despite the continued disturbance from the afflicted girls. I have lived among you as a Christian woman, attending worship when health permitted, raising my children in the fear of the Lord, conducting myself in all ways as befits a member of this community. These charges are false, and I pray that God will reveal the truth of this matter before innocent blood is shed. The afflicted girl's reaction to Sarah Osborne's presence is, if anything, more violent than their response to Sarah Good. Ann Putnam, Jr. joins Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams in their apparent torment, her 12-year-old body convulsing with spasms that make her seem much younger. A helpless child in the grip of forces beyond her control or understanding. The sight of her suffering visibly affects her parents, Thomas and Ann Putnam, Sr., whose faces show the particular anguish of parents watching their child endure pain they cannot prevent or even fully comprehend. Look how she sends her specter to work mischief, even as she proclaims her innocence. Magistrate Hathorne exclaims, gesturing toward the writhing girls with the satisfaction of someone who believes he has uncovered irrefutable proof of guilt. Your evil spirit torments these children even now. Sarah Osborne, will you continue in your denials when the evidence of your crimes writhes before our very eyes? Sarah Osborne's response reveals both her desperation and her superior education, for she attempts to engage with the theological implications of the accusations against her in a way that Sarah Good could not. Her words carry the cadence of someone familiar with religious discourse, though they also reveal her growing understanding that such familiarity may not serve her well in her current circumstances. If my specter works mischief, then it does so without my knowledge or consent, she argues, her voice growing stronger as she develops her defense. I have read that the devil can assume the shape of innocence to work his evil, appearing in their form while they sleep or pray, unaware of the use to which their likeness is being put. If these children see my shape tormenting them, then perhaps Satan has stolen my appearance to further his own dark purposes. This theological argument, while sophisticated, proves to be a tactical error in the charged atmosphere of the meeting house. The suggestion that the devil might masquerade as innocent persons raises uncomfortable questions about the reliability of spectral evidence. Questions that the magistrates and many in the assembled crowd are not prepared to entertain. If accused witches cannot be held responsible for the actions of their specters, then the entire basis for these proceedings comes into question. Magistrate Hathorne's response to Sarah Osborne's defense is swift and decisive, revealing his determination to maintain the validity of the evidence being presented by the afflicted girls. His voice, when he speaks, carries a note of warning, as if he is instructing not only the accused woman, but the entire assembly about the limits of acceptable argument in these proceedings. The learned ministers have consulted upon this matter. He declares with authority that brooks no contradiction, and they have determined that the devil cannot assume the shape of an innocent person without their consent, either given willingly or obtained through some secret sin. that provides him with legal claim upon their soul. Your specter's presence here is proof of your guilt, Sarah Osborne, and your attempts to blame the devil himself for your crimes only compound your offense. The theological certainty with which this pronouncement is made silences not only Sarah Osborne, but much of the crowd. For many present have harbored similar doubts about the nature of spectral evidence. The magistrate's declaration effectively closes off this avenue of defense, leaving the accused with no recourse but confession or continued denial in the face of what is presented as irrefutable supernatural proof. It is at this moment that Tituba is brought before the court, and her appearance marks a dramatic shift in the nature of the proceedings. Where Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne have maintained their innocence despite the evidence presented against them, Tituba's response to questioning takes a different path entirely, one that will reshape not only her own fate, but the entire scope of the witchcraft investigation. The slave woman's dark skin and foreign birth have always marked her as different in the homogeneous community of Salem Village. But now these differences take on sinister significance in the eyes of the assembled crowd. Her very appearance seems to confirm suspicions about her involvement in dark arts. And when she stands before the magistrates, the meeting house falls into a silence so complete that the sound of her breathing can be heard by those in the front rows. Magistrate Hathorne's questioning of Tituba begins with the same format used for the previous accused women, but from her first response, it becomes clear that this examination will follow a very different trajectory. When asked whether she is guilty of the charges against her, Tituba's answer sends shockwaves through the packed meeting house. "Yes," she says simply, the single word falling into the silence with the weight of a boulder dropped into still water. "I have seen the devil, and he has bid me serve him, though I resisted long before finally yielding to his commands." The confession that follows is detailed, vivid, and terrifying in its implications for the scope of witchcraft in Salem Village. Tituba describes meetings with the devil himself, a tall man in black who appeared to her with promises of wealth and power in exchange for her service. She speaks of flying through the night sky to gatherings where other witches congregated, of signing the devil's book with her own blood, of being commanded to afflict the children who now writhed in apparent agony before the court. As her testimony continues, Tituba provides names and details that expand the investigation far beyond the three women originally accused. She speaks of other witches in Salem Village and beyond, of a conspiracy that reaches into families previously considered above suspicion. Her words paint a picture of a community thoroughly infiltrated by supernatural evil, a place where neighbors who appear godly and righteous by day transform into servants of darkness when night falls. The effect of this testimony on the assembled crowd is profound and complex. On one level, there is satisfaction in having their worst fears confirmed, in learning that their suspicions about supernatural forces at work in their community were justified. On another level, there is growing terror as the scope of the threat becomes apparent, as they realize that the witchcraft conspiracy described by Tituba may extend to anyone, even those sitting in the meeting house at this very moment. The afflicted girls respond to Tituba's confession with apparent relief, their violent convulsions gradually subsiding as she describes the various ways in which she has tormented them under the devil's direction. This correlation between confession and the cessation of suffering provides what many in the audience consider to be final proof of the validity of the charges. Evidence that confession brings not only spiritual relief to the guilty, but physical relief to their victims. As the day's proceedings draw to a close, the magistrates announce their decisions regarding the three accused women. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, having maintained their innocence despite the evidence against them, are committed to jail to await trial. Their removal from the meeting house is accomplished with swift efficiency, the iron shackles that bind them creating a rhythmic clanking that echoes long after they have disappeared through the door. Tituba, having confessed her guilt and provided valuable testimony about the broader conspiracy, is also committed to jail. Though her treatment suggests that her cooperation has earned her a measure of consideration that the other accused women have not received. Her willingness to name other conspirators has transformed her from merely another accused witch into a valuable witness whose continued testimony may prove essential to uncovering the full extent of the supernatural threat facing Salem Village. The crowd disperses slowly, reluctantly, as if the drama they have witnessed has created an appetite for more revelation, more confession, more exposure of the hidden evil that apparently lurks beneath the surface of their community. Conversations continue in hushed tones as people make their way home through streets that now seem changed, charged with new significance and new danger. You walk through Salem Village in the gathering dusk, observing how the first day of formal examinations has already begun to transform the community. Houses that once seemed merely familiar now appear potentially threatening, their shuttered windows hiding occupants whose true nature has been called into question by the day's revelations. The very air seems different, thicker, as if charged with the possibility of supernatural manifestation. As night falls over Salem Village, you cannot escape the feeling that the community has crossed a threshold from which there can be no return. The confessions extracted under the pressure of legal examination have opened a door that may prove impossible to close, unleashing forces that will reshape Salem Village in ways that none of its residents can yet imagine. The meeting house stands empty now, but the echoes of the day's testimony seem to linger within its walls, waiting to be awakened by tomorrow's proceedings and the revelations they may bring. Chapter 4. Punishments and Fates. You wake on the morning of June 10th to the sound of hammering that echoes across Salem Village with the rhythm of a funeral drum. Each blow of the mallet driving home the reality that preparations for the ultimate punishment are now underway. The gallows that rise on what will come to be known as Proctor's Ledge are crude but functional. Their rough, hewn timber forming a structure that speaks to the terrible efficiency with which justice, or what passes for justice, will be administered. The intervening months since the first examinations have transformed Salem Village and the surrounding areas into something unrecognizable. A community where suspicion has replaced trust, where accusations fly with the frequency and unpredictability of summer lightning, where the bonds that once held neighbors together have been severed by fear and supernatural terror. The list of the accused has grown beyond anything the original accusers could have imagined, encompassing people from every level of society, from beggars to church members, from social outcasts to pillars of the community. You make your way through streets that buzz with a mixture of excitement and dread as word spreads that the first executions are to take place today. The intervening trials have provided a steady stream of drama and revelation, but nothing has prepared the community for the finality of what is about to occur. Death, which has always been a familiar presence in colonial life, has taken on new significance when it comes not through disease or accident, but through the deliberate action of legal authority, responding to supernatural crime. At the home of Rebecca Nurse, you pause to observe the quiet grief that emanates from the dwelling like heat from a dying fire. The elderly woman, who was once among the most respected members of Salem Village, now awaits execution. Her conviction having shocked even those who have grown accustomed to the strange turns this witchcraft investigation has taken. Her family moves about their morning tasks with the mechanical precision of people performing familiar actions while their minds struggle to comprehend an incomprehensible reality. The sound of wheels on cobblestones draws your attention to the approach of the cart that will transport the condemned to their final destination. The vehicle itself is unremarkable, a simple wooden cart of the type used daily for hauling goods and materials throughout the community. But its purpose today transforms it into something altogether more ominous. The horses that pull it seem to sense the gravity of their task, their usual spirited demeanor replaced by a subdued plodding that matches the somber mood of the occasion. Sheriff George Corwin, whose duty it is to oversee the execution of the court's sentences, approaches the task with the grim efficiency of a man who has reconciled himself to unpleasant necessity. His face shows the strain of the past months, during which he has been required to arrest neighbors, friends, and respected community members on charges that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. The weight of his responsibilities has aged him visibly, adding lines around his eyes and a stoop to his shoulders that speaks to burdens beyond those normally carried by civil authority. The first of the condemned to be brought from Salem jail is Bridget Bishop, whose case has been complicated by her reputation for unconventional behavior and her previous encounters with accusations of supernatural mischief. Her appearance as she is helped into the cart shows the effects of months in prison. Her once robust frame now gaunt from inadequate food and the stress of prolonged confinement. Yet there remains in her bearing something of the defiance that marked her responses during examination, a refusal to be completely broken by circumstances beyond her control. As the cart begins its slow progress toward Proctor's Ledge, a crowd of spectators falls in behind it, creating a procession that winds through Salem like a dark river flowing toward an inevitable destination. You join this mournful parade, swept along by the same mixture of horror and fascination that seems to grip everyone present. The sound of many feet on dirt and stone creates a rhythm that matches the turning of the cart wheels, while the murmur of voices creates an undertone of commentary and speculation that follows the condemned woman toward her fate. The route to the execution site takes the procession past familiar landmarks that have taken on new significance in light of recent events. The meeting house where the examinations took place stands as a silent witness to the legal processes that have brought this day about. Its windows reflecting the morning sun with what seems like accusatory brightness. Houses where some of the accused once lived stand empty now, their former occupants either in jail, fled, or dead, leaving behind structures that seem to mourn their absent inhabitants. At Proctor's Ledge, a crowd has already gathered, drawn by the terrible novelty of a legal execution for witchcraft, something that most present have never witnessed and hope never to see. The gallows stand ready, their rope noose swaying slightly in the morning breeze, creating shadows that dance across the ground with movements that seem almost alive. The sight of this apparatus of death sends a visible shudder through the assembled crowd, a physical manifestation of the fear and excitement that the occasion engenders. Reverend Cotton Mather, who has become one of the most vocal supporters of the witchcraft prosecutions, takes his position near the gallows, offer what spiritual comfort he can to both the condemned and the crowd. His presence lends religious authority to the proceedings, transforming what might otherwise seem like mere legal punishment into a spiritual battle between good and evil, with the community of the faithful bearing witness to the triumph of righteousness over supernatural corruption. When Cotton Mather begins to speak, his voice carries across the assembled crowd with the authority of religious conviction, mixed with intellectual certainty. His words are intended to provide context for what is about to occur, to frame the execution not as the taking of a human life, but as the necessary response to crimes that threaten the very foundations of Christian society. Good people of Salem, he declares, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. We gather today not in celebration of death, but in defense of life, not in hatred of our neighbor, but in protection of our community. The woman who stands before you has been tried by lawful authority and found guilty of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The corruption of innocent children and the service of that great enemy of mankind, the devil himself. Bridget Bishop's response to this spiritual preparation is to maintain the same stubborn dignity that has characterized her behavior throughout the long ordeal of accusation, trial, and conviction. When offered the opportunity to make a final confession that might provide some measure of spiritual comfort, she declines with words that carry across the expectant crowd with surprising clarity. I am innocent, she states simply, her voice steady despite the circumstances. I go to my death as I have lived, in the knowledge that God sees the truth of my heart, even if earthly justice has failed to recognize it. I pray that those who survive me will remember that accusations are not proof, and that fear makes poor foundation for justice. The actual mechanics of execution are accomplished with swift efficiency that speaks to the sheriff's desire to complete this grim task without unnecessary prolongation of suffering. The crowd watches in silence broken only by the sound of wind through the rope and the creaking of the wooden framework under the weight it now bears. When it is finished, a collective exhale seems to rise from the assembled spectators, as if the community itself has been holding its breath throughout the proceedings. The immediate aftermath of the execution is marked by a complex mixture of emotions that play out across the faces of those present. There is satisfaction, among those who believe that justice has been served, that a dangerous servant of evil has been removed from their midst. There is also uncertainty, even among the convinced, about whether the taking of life, based on spectral evidence and the testimony of afflicted children, represents the will of God or something altogether more problematic. As the crowd begins to disperse, you notice how people form small groups based on their reactions to what they have witnessed. Some gather around Cotton Mather, seeking reassurance that what they have seen is indeed righteous, while others cluster around more skeptical voices who question whether the proceedings have served justice or merely satisfied the bloodthirst of a community caught up in supernatural panic. The body of Bridget Bishop, according to the custom for executed criminals, is buried in a shallow grave near the execution site rather than in consecrated ground. This final indignity is intended to emphasize the spiritual condemnation that accompanies the legal punishment. But you notice that several members of the crowd seem troubled by this treatment of human remains, regardless of the crimes for which the deceased was convicted. In the days that follow the first execution, Salem Village settles into an uneasy routine marked by the knowledge that more deaths are to come. The trials continue with relentless efficiency, producing a steady stream of convictions that ensure the gallows at Proctor's Ledge will not remain unused for long. The names of those condemned to death read like a roll call of the community, including people whose presence among the accused would have been unthinkable just months before. Sarah Good, whose examination marked one of the first formal proceedings in the witchcraft investigation, faces her execution with the same defiant spirit that characterized her responses to accusation. Her final words from the gallows become part of Salem folklore, a curse pronounced against those who have condemned her to death for crimes she maintains she did not commit. "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard," she declares to Reverend Nicholas Noyes. "And if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." The execution of Rebecca Nurse on July 19th proves to be particularly troubling to the community, for her reputation for piety and good works has made her conviction difficult for many to accept. The sight of this elderly woman, bent with age and infirmity, being led to the gallows creates a crisis of conscience for some who have supported the witchcraft prosecutions. If Rebecca Nurse can be guilty of trafficking with the devil, they reason, then perhaps the criteria for identifying witches are not as reliable as they have been led to believe. John Proctor, whose name will become synonymous with principled opposition to the witch trials, goes to his death with words that ring with the authority of moral conviction. his refusal to confess to crimes he maintains he did not commit, even when such confession might save his life, provides a model of integrity that contrasts sharply with the expedient confessions that have marked many of the proceedings. His execution removes not only a human life, but also a voice of reason that has questioned the validity of spectral evidence and the reliability of the afflicted children's testimony. The hanging of Martha Corey on September 22nd represents another milestone in the progression of executions, for she was among the first to express skepticism about the reality of the afflictions that began the entire investigation. Her questioning of whether the children's fits were genuine supernatural manifestations or something altogether more mundane made her a target for accusation and eventually led to her conviction and death. The irony of her fate is not lost on those who remember her early doubts about the proceedings. Giles Corey, Martha's husband, meets his end in a manner that sets him apart from the other victims of the witchcraft investigation. His refusal to enter a plea when brought to trial results in the ancient punishment of pain fort it, dure, death by crushing under heavy stones. The prolonged agony of this execution, carried out over the course of 2 days, provides a particularly disturbing spectacle that even the most enthusiastic supporters of the witchcraft prosecutions find difficult to witness. As autumn deepens and the death toll mounts, cracks begin to appear in the consensus that has supported the witchcraft investigations. The execution of people like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, whose reputations for righteousness were beyond question, forces even the most convinced to wonder whether the mechanisms for identifying witches might be flawed. The expansion of accusations to include the wives of ministers and other pillars of the community suggests that the investigation may have grown beyond reasonable bounds. You observe these changes in community sentiment as you go about your daily tasks, noticing how conversations that once focused on the guilt or innocence of the accused now more frequently address questions about the proceedings themselves. Doubts about spectral evidence, concerns about the reliability of the afflicted children, and questions about the theological assumptions underlying the trials begin to surface in discussions that would have been unthinkable just months before. The psychological toll of the executions becomes evident in the changed atmosphere of Salem Village and the surrounding areas. The community that once took pride in its moral clarity and religious certainty now struggles with questions that have no easy answers. The blood that has been shed in the name of protecting the community from supernatural evil has not brought the peace and security that its supporters expected, but rather has created new forms of fear and uncertainty. As winter approaches, the gallows at Proctor's Ledge stand empty more often than not because the accusations have ceased, but because doubts about the entire enterprise have begun to undermine support for continued execution. The frenzy that began with concerns about the welfare of a few afflicted children has consumed 20 lives and destroyed countless others, leaving behind a community that must somehow find a way to live with the consequences of its actions. The physical reminders of the witch trials remain visible throughout Salem Village and the surrounding areas, but their meaning has begun to shift as the community grapples with the possibility that terrible injustices have been committed in the name of righteousness. The empty houses of the executed and the fled speak to the human cost of the proceedings, while the continued presence of the afflicted children raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of their testimony and the role it played in condemning their neighbors to death. Chapter 5, Legacy and Hidden Truths. You stand in Salem Village on a cold morning in May of 1693, nearly a year after the executions ended, and the silence that now pervades the community carries a weight that seems heavier than the most violent accusations ever did. The gallows at Proctor's Ledge have been dismantled, their rough timber reclaimed for more ordinary purposes. But the ground where they stood remains barren, as if the earth itself remembers what transpired there and refuses to support new growth. The morning mist clings to the village with unusual persistence, creating shapes and shadows that your mind cannot help but interpret as figures from the recent past, the specters of those who died and those who survived, all mingling in the gray air like unresolved memories seeking acknowledgement. When the wind stirs this fog, it seems to whisper with voices you recognize, speaking words that might be accusations or might be forgiveness, though the two have become so intertwined in Salem's aftermath that distinguishing between them proves impossible. The house where Rebecca Nurse once lived stands empty now, its windows reflecting the pale sky with the blank stare of abandonment. Her family, those who survived the ordeal that claimed her life, have departed Salem Village for places where their name does not carry the weight of association with the witch trials. The garden that she tended with such care has grown wild, but you notice that certain herbs continue to flourish there. Plants known for healing that seem to grow more vigorously in soil watered by tears of injustice. Governor William Phipps, whose establishment of the Court of Oyer and Terminer set the legal machinery of the witch trials in motion, has disbanded that court and established new procedures for dealing with the remaining accused. The shift in governmental policy reflects a broader change in public sentiment, a growing recognition that the mechanisms used to identify and prosecute witches may have been fundamentally flawed. Yet this official acknowledgement of error comes too late for the 20 people who lost their lives to the executioner's rope and the crushing stones of Giles, Corey's prolonged death. You walk past the meeting house where the examinations took place, and even in daylight the building seems to retain shadows from those proceedings, dark corners where accusation and desperation once echoed with such intensity that they appear to have left permanent marks on the very walls. The interior has been restored to its original configuration for worship, but you notice that attendance at services has declined markedly since the trials ended, as if many in the community find it difficult to seek divine guidance in a space so recently devoted to what many now consider to have been profound injustice. The afflicted girls, whose testimony provided the foundation for most of the convictions, have largely disappeared from public view, their former prominence replaced by a silence that speaks to the community's growing discomfort with their role in recent events. Abigail Williams has left Salem entirely, her destination unknown and her fate unrecorded by the community that once hung on her every word. Elizabeth Parris remains with her family, but her public declarations of supernatural affliction have ceased as abruptly as they began, leaving questions about their nature that may never be satisfactorily answered. Ann Putnam Jr., now 14 and approaching an age where childhood excuses for extraordinary behavior begin to lose their credibility, continues to live in Salem Village, but her demeanor has changed markedly from the dramatic figure who once commanded the attention of packed courtrooms. When you encounter her on the village streets, she avoids eye contact with the intensity of someone carrying a burden too heavy for her years, and her former tendency toward theatrical displays has been replaced by a quietness that suggests either maturity or the weight of unspoken guilt. The legal aftermath of the witch trials reveals the complex challenges involved in addressing judicial error on such a massive scale. Many of those who confess to witchcraft in order to save their lives now find themselves in the awkward position of having publicly admitted to crimes they may never have committed. Their confessions, extracted under circumstances that modern observers would recognize as coercive, but which seemed justified at the time by the apparent necessity of protecting the community from supernatural threat. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges who presided over the witch trials, has publicly acknowledged his error in a statement read from the pulpit of Boston's South Church. His confession of judicial wrongdoing represents a rare moment of official accountability, though it comes at a personal cost that reflects the broader trauma experienced by all who participated in the proceedings. The judge's acknowledgement that he acted from sincere but misguided motives provides little comfort to the families of those who died, but it does offer a model for how a community might begin to address the consequences of collective error. The economic impact of the witch trials extends far beyond the immediate costs of legal proceedings and imprisonment. Families whose breadwinners were executed or forced to flee have fallen into poverty, their property often seized to pay jail fees and court costs. The disruption of normal agricultural activities during the height of the accusations has contributed to food shortages and economic hardship that affect the entire community, creating a cycle of suffering that extends the trials' impact far beyond their official conclusion. You visit the site where John Proctor's farm once thrived, now largely abandoned and returning to wilderness. The fields that once produced grain to feed Salem village lie fallow, their furrows slowly being reclaimed by the forest that surrounds them. The house stands empty, its windows broken and its door hanging open like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Yet even in its abandonment, the property retains something of the dignity that characterized its former owner, as if the land itself remembers his refusal to compromise his integrity, even when faced with death. The theological questions raised by the witch trials continue to trouble ministers and faithful throughout New England, forcing a re-examination of beliefs about the nature of supernatural evidence and the relationship between divine will and human justice. The use of spectral evidence, once accepted as valid proof of supernatural crime, is now widely questioned by religious authorities who recognize that such testimony can be neither verified nor refuted through normal means. This theological shift represents a fundamental change in how the community understands the intersection of the supernatural and the legal. Cotton Mather, whose support for the witch trials was both influential and public, finds himself in the difficult position of defending actions that many now consider misguided while maintaining his authority as a religious leader. His attempts to justify the proceedings while acknowledging their tragic outcomes reveal the complex challenge faced by anyone who played a prominent role in events that history seems likely to judge harshly. The intellectual framework he provided for understanding witchcraft as a literal, prosecutable crime has been severely undermined by the trial's aftermath, forcing a reassessment of beliefs that once seemed unquestionable. As you continue your walk through Salem Village, you notice how physical reminders of the witch trials have been quietly removed or allowed to decay, as if the community hopes that eliminating visible traces of the events might somehow diminish their psychological impact. The pillory where some of the accused were confined has been dismantled. The jail where they awaited trial has been emptied and largely abandoned. And even the roads that led to Proctor's Ledge seem less well maintained than they once were, as if traffic to that location is being subtly discouraged. Yet, despite these efforts to erase the physical evidence of what occurred, the psychological and social impact of the witch trials proves more resistant to elimination. Families that were divided by accusations continue to maintain their distance from one another. Former neighbors avoid interaction whenever possible, and the easy trust that once characterized community relationships has been replaced by a wariness that colors every social interaction. The fabric of Salem Village has been torn in ways that may prove impossible to repair. The question of what really happened during the months when accusations flew with such devastating frequency remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Were the afflicted girls genuinely tormented by supernatural forces, or were their fits the product of psychological pressure, social manipulation, or simple fraud? The historical record provides no definitive answer, leaving each observer to draw conclusions based on their own understanding of human nature and supernatural possibility. Some residents of Salem Village have developed theories that attribute the girls' behavior to ergot poisoning from contaminated grain, an explanation that would account for the hallucinogenic symptoms they displayed without requiring belief in either supernatural influence or deliberate deception. This medical hypothesis offers the comfort of a natural explanation for extraordinary events, though it fails to account for all aspects of the girls' behavior or the specific nature of their accusations. Others in the community have come to believe that the afflicted girls were indeed engaged in deliberate fraud, their fits carefully calculated to achieve goals that may have included personal attention, social advancement, or the settling of family grudges through the elimination of inconvenient neighbors. This interpretation casts the girls as calculating manipulators rather than innocent victims, a perspective that transforms the tragedy of the witch trials from supernatural drama into human betrayal of the most profound kind. A third group maintains that something genuinely supernatural occurred in Salem Village, though they increasingly question whether the forces involved were as clearly demonic as originally assumed. The possibility that the girls encountered something genuinely otherworldly but misunderstood its nature opens the door to explanations that preserve belief in the supernatural, while acknowledging that the community's response may have been tragically inappropriate. The passage of time has begun to create space for perspectives on the witch trials that were impossible while emotions ran high and the community remained divided between accusers and accused. Historical distance allows for analysis that recognizes the complex factors that contributed to the tragedy. Religious extremism, social tension, economic hardship, political instability, and the psychological pressures of living in an isolated frontier community during a period of significant cultural change. You pause at the Salem Village Cemetery, where some of the victims of the witch trials rest in unmarked graves, their names deliberately omitted from the official record as part of their punishment for supernatural crime. The absence of proper memorialization reflects the community's early determination to erase these individuals from memory. But you notice that someone has been placing small stones on certain graves. The traditional Jewish way of honoring the dead that has somehow found its way into this Puritan community as a quiet form of remembrance. The wind that moves through the cemetery carries with it the scent of earth and decay, but also something else, something that might be the lingering essence of unresolved grief. You kneel beside one of these unmarked graves, feeling the cold ground beneath your knees, and wonder about the person who lies beneath the soil. Were they guilty of the crimes for which they died? Or were they victims of a community's fear that had grown beyond all reasonable bounds? The earth provides no answers. Only the eternal silence of the dead who carry their secrets beyond the reach of human investigation. As you rise from the gravesite, you notice a figure watching you from the edge of the cemetery. An elderly woman whose face bears the lines of someone who has witnessed too much sorrow. When she approaches, you recognize her as Martha Corey's sister, one of the few family members who remained in Salem Village after the trials ended. Her presence here suggests that she, like you, finds herself drawn to these unmarked graves by a need to bear witness that official history has failed to provide. They were good people, she says quietly, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the bare branches overhead. Not all of them, perhaps, but most were no more guilty of witchcraft than you or I. The fear took hold of us all, made us see evil where there was only human frailty, made us believe that our neighbors could transform into servants of darkness between sunset and dawn. Her words hang in the air between you, carrying the weight of hard, won wisdom and bitter experience. The admission that the community may have been wrong about the nature of the supernatural threat it faced represents a profound shift from the certainty that characterized the height of the witch trials. Yet this acknowledgement comes at a terrible cost, paid in lives that cannot be restored and trust that may never be rebuilt. The conversation that follows reveals the complex process by which individuals and communities come to terms with their participation in events they later recognize as tragic mistakes. The woman speaks of her own initial belief in the accusations, her gradual recognition that something was fundamentally wrong with the proceedings, and her current struggle to understand how people she had known and trusted could have participated in what she now sees as judicial murder. The children seemed so sincere, she reflects, her eyes distant as she remembers the packed meeting house and the dramatic testimony that swayed so many hearts and minds. Their suffering appeared genuine, their terror real. How were we to know that such convincing displays might spring from sources other than supernatural torment? We had been taught to trust the innocent, to believe that children could not fabricate such elaborate deceptions. This observation touches on one of the most disturbing aspects of the Salem Witch Trials, the central role played by children and young adults whose testimony was accepted with minimal skepticism by adult authorities. The assumption that the young were incapable of sophisticated deception or manipulation proved tragically wrong. But it reflected broader cultural beliefs about childhood innocence that made questioning their accounts seem almost sacrilegious. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the cemetery, other visitors begin to appear, drawn by the same mixture of curiosity, guilt, and need for closure that has brought you to this place. Some come to pray at the graves of family members, others to grapple with their own roles in the events that unfolded here. The cemetery has become an unofficial place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how their community could have gone so terribly wrong. An unexpected encounter occurs when you notice a familiar figure moving among the graves with the careful gait of someone whose health has been compromised by prolonged hardship. It is Tituba, the slave woman whose confession helped to fuel the early stages of the witch trials. Now freed from prison, but bearing the visible marks of her months in confinement, her presence in the cemetery is surprising, for she was among the few accused who survived the trials by confessing to crimes she may never have committed. When she notices your attention, Tituba approaches with the resignation of someone who has grown accustomed to being the object of curiosity and suspicion. Her dark eyes hold depths that speak to experiences beyond those of most people in this community. Knowledge gained not only from her years of slavery and her foreign birth, but from her unique position as both accuser and accused in the complex drama of the witch trials. "I come here to remember," she says simply, her accented English carrying musical inflections that mark her Caribbean origins. Not to celebrate or to mourn, but to remember. The dead here, they deserve that someone should know their names, should speak of what happened to them, even if the stones above them remain unmarked. Her words reveal a perspective on the witch trials that differs markedly from those of the other survivors. Having been forced to confess to supernatural crimes in order to save her life, Tituba occupies a unique position in Salem's aftermath, neither completely victim nor completely perpetrator, but something more complex that defies easy categorization. Her survival came at the cost of public admission to practices she may never have engaged in, creating a burden of false confession that she must carry for the remainder of her life. The conversation that develops between you and Tituba provides insights into aspects of the witch trials that have been largely overlooked in the community's efforts to understand what occurred. She speaks of the pressure applied to extract confessions, the leading questions that shape the testimony of the accused, and the psychological techniques used to break down the resistance of those who initially maintained their innocence. They wanted names, she recalls, her voice taking on a distant quality as she remembers the interrogation sessions that ultimately led to her survival. Always more names, more details about meetings that never happened, about flights through the night sky that existed only in their imagination. The truth was not enough for them. They needed stories that confirmed their fears, that justified their actions. This revelation about the coercive nature of the confession process sheds new light on the testimonies that formed the foundation for many of the convictions. If accused witches were pressured to provide specific details that matched investigators' preconceptions about supernatural crime, then the consistency of their accounts may reflect not the accuracy of their testimony, but the effectiveness of their interrogators in shaping the narratives they wanted to hear. As evening approaches and the cemetery begins to empty of visitors, you find yourself alone among the graves with questions that seem to have no satisfactory answers. The witch trials of Salem Village represent a complex intersection of religious belief, social tension, psychological manipulation, and legal process that produce tragedy on a scale that continues to challenge understanding more than a year after the executions ended. The sun sets behind clouds that have gathered throughout the day, casting the cemetery in shades of gray and silver that seem appropriate to the somber nature of your reflections. The unmarked graves around you hold their secrets close, offering no final revelation about the guilt or innocence of those who rest beneath the earth. Yet there very presence serves as a reminder that the human cost of the witch trials extended far beyond the legal proceedings that dominated public attention at the time. As you prepare to leave the cemetery and return to the village proper, you notice that someone has left a small bouquet of wildflowers on one of the unmarked graves. The gesture is simple but profound, a recognition of the humanity of the person, buried there regardless of the crimes for which they may have been convicted, in a community still struggling to come to terms with its recent past. Such acts of quiet remembrance may represent the beginning of a healing process that will take generations to complete. The walk back through Salem Village in the gathering darkness reveals a community still marked by the events of the past year, but one that has begun the slow process of rebuilding trust and social cohesion. Lights appear in windows that have been dark for months as families return from exile or emerge from the isolation that characterized the height of the witch trials. The sounds of normal domestic life, conversations, laughter, children playing, provide a counterpoint to the silence and suspicion that have dominated the community for too long. Yet, underneath this return to normalcy runs an undercurrent of awareness that Salem Village will never again be the same community it was before the witch trials began. The bonds of trust that once held neighbors together have been strained to the breaking point and beyond, creating fractures in the social fabric that may never fully heal. The knowledge that accusations of supernatural crime can destroy lives and families with devastating efficiency has created a wariness that colors every interaction, every disagreement, every moment of social tension. The meeting house stands at the center of the village, as it always has, but its role in the community has been fundamentally altered by its use as a courtroom for the witch examinations. What was once solely a place of worship and community gathering now carries associations with legal proceedings that many in the village would prefer to forget. The building's continued presence serves as a constant reminder of the events that unfolded within its walls, making it impossible for the community to completely escape the shadow of its recent past. As you reach your own home and prepare for the night ahead, you cannot escape the feeling that Salem Village exists now in a state of suspended animation, caught between a past it cannot change and a future it cannot clearly envision. The witch trials have ended, but their legacy continues to shape every aspect of community life, from the way neighbors interact to the manner in which religious and civil authority is exercised. The questions raised by the events of the past year extend far beyond Salem Village to challenge fundamental assumptions about justice. Evidence and the relationship between religious belief and legal practice, the use of spectral evidence, the acceptance of children's testimony without skepticism, and the assumption that confession necessarily indicates guilt, have all been called into question by the trial's tragic outcomes, forcing a broader reconsideration of how such proceedings should be conducted. The darkness outside your window seems different tonight, charged with the awareness that Salem Village has become part of a larger historical narrative about the dangers of mass hysteria, religious extremism, and the breakdown of rational legal process. The events that began with concerns about a few afflicted children have grown into something that will be remembered and studied for generations. A cautionary tale about the fragility of justice and the ease with which fear can overwhelm reason. Yet even as Salem Village struggles to come to terms with its role in this historical tragedy, there are signs that the community retains the capacity for healing and renewal. The quiet acts of remembrance at unmarked graves, the gradual return of exiled families, and the efforts of individuals like Judge Sewall to acknowledge error and seek forgiveness all suggest that the human capacity for redemption may ultimately prove stronger than the forces that drove the community to such destructive extremes. As sleep finally comes, your dreams are filled with images of Salem Village as it was before the witch trials began, a community of faithful people struggling to build lives of meaning and purpose in a challenging frontier environment. Perhaps, with time and effort, it may become such a place again, though the shadows of the recent past will always remain as reminders of how quickly trust can be destroyed and how difficult it proves to rebuild once lost. The witch trials of Salem Village end not with dramatic revelation or final understanding, but with the gradual recognition that some questions may have no satisfactory answers, that some wounds may never fully heal, and that the price of wisdom sometimes includes the acceptance of tragedy that cannot be undone. In the silence that follows the storm of accusation and execution, Salem Village begins the long journey toward whatever form of peace may be possible for a community that has learned too much about the darkness that can dwell in human hearts. End of Salem Witch Trials, Dark Secrets for a Bedtime Story. If you enjoyed this story and want to join me for more nights of history and mystery, subscribe now, tap the bell icon, and let's journey back in time together.